Thanks very much for joining me. Today I'm going to be speaking about social control in Middle Kingdom Egypt. Ancient Egypt was a very unequal society. Its hierarchical system of governance consisted of sole rule by a king, who held ultimate property rights over the land, supported by a relatively small group of elite officials. The ideological system focused around kingship, legitimizing not only the ruler, but also the administrators who acted on his behalf. They maintained control to an extent through coercive power. Violence was certainly part of maintaining this, but control was also exerted much more subtly. Arguably more powerful than any physical violence was the compliance that was cultivated within this system, in which individuals both experienced and enacted their position in society, upholding the status quo through their daily practices. In this talk, I particularly want to explore the role of embodied experience in social control. So much of society and social dynamics are expressed and embedded through embodied practice, through one's movement, gestures, interactions, and experience of physical spaces. Although we cannot access ancient Egyptian lived experience, a combination of sources can help us reconstruct something of them, with help from theoretical approaches. Of course, representations are not at all the same as reality, they're constructs, but they still offer glimpses into elite worldview and how this served to reinforce the existing social structure. I look at the Middle Kingdom specifically, so roughly 1975 to 1630 BCE, examining evidence from both literary texts and tomb decoration through a sociological lens, particularly through concepts from the work of Bourdieu, Emile Durkheim, Michel Foucault, and Erving Goffman. In particular, we'll look at examples that demonstrate the relationship between body and mind. How did these inform our understanding of how physical interactions shaped ancient Egyptians' experience of their place in society and how they saw themselves? Bourdieu's concepts of habitus and symbolic violence are particularly useful in examining how social control could be maintained outside the use of coercive force. Bourdieu defined the concept of habitus as a system which integrated past experiences to shape an individual's perceptions and actions, influencing their future behavioral possibilities. Habitus captures the permanent internalization of the social order in the human body, which predisposes individuals to act in a certain manner. Symbolic violence unconsciously convinces people through cultural expressions and experiences that the existing social organization is natural and justified, paving the way for legitimate domination, in which the elite are defined as the people who are most fit to rule. Thus, social control is maintained through indirect, cumulative cultural processes rather than overt coercion. Certainly, elite Egyptian culture presents an assumption that society was naturally structured. The literary text The Dialogue of Ipaware and the Lord of All laments a reversal of order in an upturned world. Look, all the offices, they are not in their place. Individuals were meant to know and respect their position in society and not overstep their mark. Through body language, gestures, and spatial relationships, as well as representations of these, members of society learned to know their place and to self-regulate. Hierarchy was literally made visible through spatial positioning. For example, the teaching of Ptahhotep describes how one's professional position and status should dictate seating arrangements. If you are a member of the courts, stand and sit according to your position. This is comparable to the hierarchical arrangement in processions of officials, in tomb chapel decoration and tomb models, and the relative hierarchies of sitting and standing, in which sitting, especially on chairs, was ranked as more privileged. In tomb decoration, hierarchy dictated sequential organization within registers according to rank. Intimates and family members of the tomb owner are most often given the highest ranking, alongside the most senior administrative positions and posts with royal connections. For example, a depiction of Khnumhotep II seated in a chair with his officials standing in a row behind him is arranged in descending rank from those closest to him. The names and titles read from left to right. Acquaintance of his lord Nacht, Steward Nechtru-hotep, Scribe Ameni, Scribe Khnumhotep, and finally Mat-spreader Senwosret. Although these are ultimately only visual representations, they may also give an indication of what was expected as part of official settings and public events. To have to position oneself according to hierarchical ordering was to physically experience one's rank in society, a form of symbolic violence that would have helped reinforce the social status quo. In social interactions, gestures were used to show respect towards higher-ranking individuals, on a scale according to difference in status, ranging from just bending the arm to also bending the back in a slight or deep bow, or even prostration on the ground. Both elite and non-elite could be expected to bow. For example, the epithet, one to whom the great ones come bowing, commonly expresses a high official stature amongst his peers. Similarly, one who bends his arm to his superiors, i.e. making the gesture of respect. In the tale of Sinuhe, Sinuhe is described as bowing at the hips, kissing the earth and touching the earth, so kneeling to touch the ground with his face, and being on his belly, totally prostrate. Physical lowering would have likely been internalized to some extent, even though it could also be done cynically. This kind of downward orientation, literally a degradation, can cause feelings of humility and deference, and the routine repetition of this habitualized motion would have reinforced a sense of subjugation. Literary texts encourage conformity with these practices and suggest a certain measure of anxiety amongst the elite audience about the extent of the required debasement. The teaching of Ptahhotep refers to this a number of times. For example, if you encounter a disputant in his moment, an authoritative man who is better off than you, bend your arms, bow your back. Similarly, bow your back to your superiors, and the arm is not sprained by bearing it. They offer reassurance that compliance need not be considered shameful, even though it served as a sign of subordination. But while elite monuments and literary texts frequently refer to officials bowing, in tomb decoration, they are only ever shown making the gesture of respect, holding their arm to their chest, even when standing directly before the tomb owner. Only laborers are shown physically lowering themselves in a bow. For example, in Beni Hassan tomb number 15, both an official and a herdsman make a gesture of respect to Bakhet III, but while the herdsman bows, the official stands erect. This suggests that this difference in bowing was used to visually distinguish elite and non-elite, and these representations were ultimately constructs intended to uphold the status of the tomb owner. This diversion illuminates the anxieties felt by officials concerning their position in society and the challenges of negotiating status within the elite while maintaining their distinction from the non-elite. In tomb decoration, scenes of punishment of tax evaders show some laborers as bowing voluntarily, while others are forced into a bow. Representations of individuals being forced into a bow may represent instances of resistance, a refusal to conform, But these selective displays of coercive power may also have been intended to communicate the futility of resistance. While voluntary self-lowering expressed deference, forcible lowering, especially in public, could have been denigrating and potentially shameful. Status was measured by one's proximity to the king, or to a lesser extent to other high officials. But proximity was carefully managed and controlled. The Stela of Intef describes his role in maintaining physical and social divisions, describing him as one who acts as a door for what is and what is not, favourite of the king in his palace, in keeping commoners distant from him. And while tomb chapel decoration depicts the elite and their dependents together in the idyllic setting of the tomb owner's estate, there is little direct interaction shown between tomb owners and their subordinates. The tomb owner is almost always shown set apart, separated from the rest of society by various means, such as a huge offering table or the columns of a pavilion, his staff, which marks a dividing line between him and his dependents, or vertical columns writing his titles and name. Separation psychologically reinforces ideological distinctions between social groups, and in particular, physical distance would have aided officials in cultivating the emotional distancing that they idealized. For example, elite epithets in self-presentation exert self-control and emotional detachment, such as cool-tempered and calm or self-controlled, free from passion. And the teaching of Ptahhotep advises his audience to suppress your heart, control your mouth, so that your affairs will be amongst the officials. This detachment would have contributed to elite self-assurance, aiding their ability to mete out punishment and helping legitimize their appropriation of resources. Preserving a spatial separation between social ranks also served to maintain deference. The teaching of Keti counsels keeping an appropriate distance from high officials. If you walk in attendance on great ones, approach from afar, behind the end rank. Sociologist Goffman termed the creation of physical separation in order to maintain social distance and encourage a sense of awe, mystification. Goffman saw restriction of access as a key element in generating deference, resulting in the audience cooperating and acting in a respectful fashion. The dialogue of Ipuwer and the Lord of All refers positively to this tension between elites' visibility and separation. In Ipuwer's presentation of an idealized world, the elite are distinguished by their fine attire and regalia and stand apart from the general celebration, observing rather than participating. The distinguished ones of the estate stand, watching the jubilation from their houses, clad in best quality linen, holding staves before them. The sense of awe cultivated by this elite display would have been further heightened through the use of dress, ornamentation, regalia, and the symbolic decoration of elite architecture. Of course, maintaining distance and personal boundaries was a privilege accorded only to the elite. And positive feelings of awe were not the only emotion that the elite wished to provoke in aid of their maintenance of social order. Literary texts often refer to laborers as fearful, but they also make it clear that being in the presence of others significantly higher in rank was meant to induce fear also, regardless of status. This is sometimes described as so extreme that it is physically overwhelming and incapacitating. A lesser level of unease may have been induced amongst labourers by the presence of overseers. The infringement of labourers' personal space was likely used as a method of control. Anthropologist E.T. Hall argued that each individual carries about them a proxemic bubble, that represents our personal three-dimensional space. If someone unfamiliar enters this space, we feel threatened. Tomb decoration and tomb models often present degrees of proximity between overseers and laborers that might have been felt to be intrusive or intimidating. The majority of overseers are depicted facing workers' backs, as if they were standing over them from behind, a position which would mean that the workers could not properly see the overseers. For example, on the west wall in the tomb of Amenemhat, 15 of the overseers stand behind laborers, while only 3 of them face them directly. In tomb models, too, overseer figures generally stand over workers and are often positioned behind. Standing over someone conveys dominance, but in particular, the unseen presence of a dominant figure can induce a sense of unease and loss of control. Overseers played a key role in the maintenance of social control, not only in their ability to administer coercive force, but also in facilitating the distancing of the elite, allowing them to preserve their separation from the rest of society. In tomb decoration, social interaction is carried out through intermediaries who act on the tomb owner's behalf. Presumably, direct contact between ranks, even in visual representation, was deemed inappropriate. Within the organization of wall's decorative scheme, the tomb owner is usually positioned at one end of a wall in order to observe everything that is being done, and the majority of the figures are oriented towards him, but generally only officials approach him directly. When leading or presenting lower-class figures to the tomb owner, officials face their superior while looking back towards the lower-class figure, enabling them to bridge the social divide. Most of these officials use both a gesture of respect and a beckoning gesture that may convey their role as facilitators. The use of intermediaries allowed the elite to extend reach of their control, particularly in the management of labor on the estate. In tomb decoration, sometimes multiple levels of supervision and hierarchy are present within a single grouping. For example, in a scene in the tomb of Khnumhotep II, showing washermen with an unnamed overseer of washermen who works alongside them and presumably serves as a foreman, while the scene as a whole is supervised by a sealer who stands observing their work. The presence of overseers implied that laborers required supervision, partially to guard against theft of valuable resources, but also to enforce obedience and ensure that they continued working. Ipuwer actually similarly characterizes washermen as lazily neglectful of their work. The washerman has no intention of carrying his load. The distance created by the use of intermediaries was controlled to suit the elite. It could be collapsed through the presence of scribes, who could keep a written record, formalizing any infraction and transmitting it to higher authorities. On the other hand, the distance probably actually made it more difficult for lower-class individuals to defend themselves and potentially challenge the social order. When the eloquent peasant Kunanut pleads with the official who's robbing him, noting that the high steward will punish thieves, the villainous official says, "I'm the one who speaks to you." Essentially, that's all well and good, but it's me that you actually have to deal with. The control exerted over some occupations severely curtailed their freedom of movement, as implied by Ipuwer, who laments that those who used not to see the day have come forth unhindered. A similar statement in the teaching of Kedi suggests that some workers were virtually imprisoned. The mat maker has to give provisions to the doorkeeper to let him see daylight. These texts suggest that the role of doorkeepers, who are often depicted in wooden tomb models of workplaces like granaries or butcheries, was not just to protect access to valuable resources, but also to control the movement of workers. This use of doorkeepers and surveillance would have likely fostered a sense of authority amongst those doing the observing, but also a sense of potential deviancy amongst those being observed. The need to watch someone transforms that person into someone who is potentially untrustworthy, who is inherently more morally suspect than the person doing the observing, and this may have been negatively internalized. The use of architecture in exerting this control indicates an intentional manipulation of access and surveillance. Elevation facilitated observation. Many model granaries feature upper stories with overseers and scribes watching from above, as do depictions of granaries in tomb decoration. Architecture rarely features in tomb decoration, so the choice to display this control of space is noteworthy, indicating a desire to demonstrate and reinforce the hierarchical dynamics of social interaction. In the Maitland granary model, the scribes occupy a different position of control by sitting along the sides of a long vestibule. Dorothea Arnold has noted that the organization of workers in elongated corridor-like rooms would have been easy to oversee and may have been used to enforce control, similar to some of the buildings in the workmen's village at Giza. Controlled access, restricted sightlines, and elevated vantage points would have enhanced elite control. This is essentially relatable to Foucault's concept of disciplinary power, in which individuals under surveillance end up monitoring their own behavior, in effect disciplining themselves. Their consciousness of their surveillance would have likely contributed to their social conformity. The rural domain in which most of the Egyptian population lived and labored was almost entirely lacking in opportunities for surveillance, though, which made public demonstrations of power and authority all the more important. In particular, the cattle count, when all livestock in the land were rounded up, counted, and taxed by the state, served as an opportunity to gather the populace and put elite authority and hierarchical control on display. Public gatherings like these provided the rare occasions when a broad swathe of Egyptian society was present and able to interact to a limited extent. However, representations of the cattle count in tomb decoration and tomb models show that these were very carefully managed arenas of interaction that visually and emotionally reinforced social subordination. An important feature of the cattle count was the public physical punishment of tax evaders. Tax evaders are shown being subjected to dehumanizing treatment, sometimes being roped and herded with sticks, like the cattle in their charge, before being beaten. The teaching of Ptahhotep presents the elite use of violence as legitimate, distinguished from generic violent behavior, usually associated with the lower classes, for example, the scene on the right of fighting boatmen. The official's punishment is emotionally restrained and asserts moral authority. The lower elite administrated the beatings, acting as intermediaries for the high officials. The cattle count model of Margaret shows the beating of a tax evader taking place directly before the high official, who sits above in judgment on a raised platform, observing. This arrangement added legitimacy to the punishment, strengthening the alignment of lower elite interests with those of their superiors. The speech caption of an overseer instructing the beating, shown in the tomb of Bakhet III, reads, "May you put him to the ground, because it is my wish." The hierarchical structure allowed lower-ranking officials to distance themselves from actual responsibility, while distancing high officials from the violence itself. This is similar to the manner in which the elite are shown hunting, using spears, bows and arrows, or throw sticks. And while exerting their dominance over the natural world, they always maintain their distance. It is only their intermediaries who actually handle and carry their carcasses. In The Eloquent Peasant, punishment is presented as something that is done to those who deserve it. Kununurp urges, deal punishment to the punishable. Thus, to punish is to make deviant. The punishable becomes so through the application of punishment. Ipperworth similarly suggests that corporal punishment was not considered appropriate for the elite. As part of the description of a world upturned, he laments that those who used to wear fine linen are beaten wrongly. The implication is that this kind of degrading treatment only befits the lower classes and is inappropriate for officials. The automatic suspicion against the lower classes as potentially deviant and naturally deserving of punishment is exemplified in the tale of the Eloquent Peasant. When the peasant Kununurp presents his case to the high steward against the official who's robbed him, he is immediately suspected of fabricating his claim. Even when he is eventually believed, he is still administered a beating, simply as a matter of course, presumably to reinforce his subordinates in a situation where he is essentially challenging the social order. This kind of response seems intended to discourage the lower class individuals from defending themselves, and most would probably have been put off pursuing further grievances, or even pursuing them in the first place. Indeed, more detailed evidence from later in Egyptian history, during the Roman period, indicates that very few petitions were made by the lower classes. By beating people, treating them as animals, the lower classes are confirmed as potentially deviant, degraded, and suited to their station in life. These relatively rare displays of violence reinforce class identity and would have helped induce a psychological state in which all members of society were taught to know their place. That this was experienced as part of a public display, communally, demonstrated shared acceptance of this system. So to conclude, the threat of physical violence, but also more subtle symbolic violence, help foster self-subordination. The use of space, in particular separation and distancing between the high elite and non-elite, maintained a sense of mystification versus the infringement of personal space for the lower classes to induce a sense of lack of control. Gestures and bowing cultivated deference, communicating and reinforcing social status. Intermediaries were used to manage and legitimize social control, while observation and public displays of punishment created a sense of authority versus potential deviancy. Thus, hierarchy was ingrained in everyday practices and behaviors to such an extent that everyone experienced their status, both physically and mentally, reinforcing social control and the status quo. Thank you very much for your kind attention, and especially to the conference organizers, Alexandra and Christ College, Cambridge. Thank you.